Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, Dan Barker joins us. For those that don't know, Dan Barker is an American atheist activist and musician who served as an evangelical Christian preacher and composer for 19 years. But he left Christianity in 1984. Dan was PR director for the Freedom from Religion Foundation from 1987 to 2004. And he eventually was elected co-president of the foundation with Annie Laurie Gaylor in 2004, with whom he is co-host of the Free Thought Radio, a national weekly talk show, and Free Thought Matters, a national weekly TV show. Well, welcome to History Valley, Dan.
Why, Jacob? Nice to be here.
Same here. So today we're talking about your book, Godless, How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists. I have the link in the description below for anyone who wants to go take a look at his book and purchase it. It's on Kindle. It's also on paperback. It's on Amazon and other websites. All the relevant information is in the description below. All right, let's get started. What was the first thing that you can remember that caused you to doubt your beliefs in Christianity?
So the first things didn't seem like doubts. Within Christianity, there's a variety of theologies and interpretations. There is no one Christianity. And I was an extreme Bible-believing Christian, all the way on the right side. The Bible's literally true. Jesus is coming soon. There is a devil, there is a hell, there's a heaven, and people need to be born again, all of that. And I accepted Christ as my Savior. And as I describe in the book, Godless, my transition was gradual. It was like 4 or 5 years. And so when I look back on it, it would be like asking you, when did you grow up? You probably couldn't point to one exact moment, but you can point to a process in your life where you changed. So I moved gradually. When my Christian musicals were being performed around the country, around the world, actually, I got invited to speak and perform my music at churches other than the extreme, far right Bible believing. And I started meeting pastors with different theologies. And there may be as many Christianities as there are Christians. If you look at the spectrum from the extreme right side over to here to the extreme left, where it's pretty much liberal teaching, I moved across that spectrum gradually, and I tasted a little bit. I talked to pastors all over the country. And I do remember way back here in the early parts when I was visiting a church in Southern California, and this pastor, before the meeting, sometimes we meet in a prayer room or in the pastor's office and pray for God's Spirit to bless the meeting. And we were in his office, I remember, and he said something to me about how he had some members of his church who did not think Adam and Eve were literal people. And I was shocked. I was even thinking, how can you let them be members of your church? I mean, they're calling God a liar. And he said, well, don't get me wrong. I believe they were literal people, but these members of my church, they're really good people. They're good Christians. They donate, they volunteer, they're loving, they're great people, but they think that some parts of the Bible are more metaphorical than other parts. Obviously, that's true. When Jesus said, I am the door, we don't look for a doorknob and hinges. We all knew that there's some level of metaphor in the Bible. But these members of my church, this pastor told me, they think that just like Jesus told the parable of the prodigal son or the parable of the Good Samaritan, not intending for us to take it literally. It's a story. There probably was not an actual prodigal son. There's not even a name, with an address. It was a made up story to teach an important moral truth. And it's the moral truth that's important. It's not the actual historical story. Just like Jesus was able to make up stories or pass on stories that were, metaphorical or made up, the ancient Israelites also made up some stories, including the story of Adam and Eve. It was a parable. It was a metaphor. It wasn't so much that there actually had to be a real Adam and a real Eve, but the important moral tale. And of course, what tale is more important to the moral structure and salvation of the Bible than Genesis 3, right? So he said, those people of my congregation, they think that the Israelites never intended, and the readers never even intended it to be actual literal people. And now, from what we know about evolution, there could not have been a first man and a first woman. And even if there was, they wouldn't have come out of the Middle East, they would have come out of Africa. So for all these reasons, this pastor was telling me, these members of mine church, they're good people, they think Adam and Eve was more of a metaphorical story. And I was shocked. I was thinking, whoa, how can, I mean, that's like heresy, right? Not to think that the Bible is telling the truth. But I had to admit, this wasn't a doubt. It didn't plant a doubt in my mind. It planted a question. And I was thinking, well, okay, so they're good Christians, and we fellowship together. Should I allow that difference in interpretation to stop our fellowship as Christians, or should I embrace them and love them anyway, even though we have a difference of opinion? So that was kind of like, for me, as a real extremist, binary-brained, absolutist, fundamentalist Christian, for me to even make that move, it wasn't toward atheism. It was just a move toward a little more liberalizing and being a little less certain and a little more humble. You know what I mean? I remember thinking questions like that. And as I went through those years, I gradually moved a little more, a little more, a little more, a little more. And in the book, I tell the whole story basically, but I finally became sort of more of a moderate Christian, where my sermons were less about hell and heaven and the afterlife and more about how do you live this life, more of a moderate type of daily Christian living. I wasn't even close to atheism there, but my Christian theology was modifying. And you find that within any religion, there's all these different flavors. And so after a while within Christianity, eventually I moved more over here to where I thought, well, gosh, so if the prodigal son is a parable, and if Adam and Eve are a metaphor, and they're expressing great truths no matter what, well, what else in the Bible is metaphorical? Where do you draw that line? What other character in the Bible might be? Maybe even Yahweh is a metaphor. Maybe even God himself is just some story that the ancient Israelites and other people made up, and that it doesn't matter if he exists. It's not relevant to the truth of the story. And that, you know what I mean? That's really liberal talk. So basically, that's kind of what happened in my thinking. A lot of these questions about the reliability of the Bible, the questions about can you be good without God, and even can you be good with God if you follow the Bible, did the resurrection of Jesus really happen, or is that just a contradictory story? A lot of these questions, for me as a fundamentalist, I know not all Christians struggle with the same things, but for me it was the reliability of the Bible, which crumbled, and eventually, and then of course morality. Can you be a good person without the Bible itself? So that's a long story made very, very short.
What made those particular Christians you were just talking about a moment ago think that Adam and Eve were not literal?
Well, I suppose they were educated, more educated than I was. They knew about evolution. They knew about geography. They knew about comparative religions. They knew these. They knew that the name Adam isn't really a name; it's just a description. It means the man. He was made from the mud. Uh, I don't think anybody believes we were made from the mud, and I don't think anyone believes scientifically that a woman was made from the rib of a man. So I never talked to those Christians. I never spoke with them, but I now can guess a little bit about how even within Christianity there are good Christians who are smart people who are interpreting it to align with what they know about science and evolution. So that would be my guess about their motives.
Did the fear of hell stagnate your process of deconverting or not really?
Uh, did it stagnate it? It was a factor. Um, I think hell is the idea of hell is a very powerful force to, I think it's horrible that we teach it to children, that if you're not saved, if you're not born again, you're going to burn forever. I mean, fire, that hurts. I mean, pain, suffering forever. So yeah, I believed in hell, and I believed the Bible was telling the truth when it talked about hell. And so it's a psychological adjustment that you have to make. It's a tough one to realize there is no such thing as hell. Okay, there's no such thing as hell. I can give a brief analogy. When I was a missionary in Mexico back in 1967, I was 18 years old. I was bit and torn up by a dog, by a German Shepherd. Before that time, I had no fear of dogs. I just thought dogs were dogs, and they bark. But we were playing volleyball outside of a church, and the ball went over the adobe wall, and so I jumped over and then, boy, it was horrible. I won't show you the scars, but I still have the scars from that experience. And so I went to the hospital, and I suffered a bit, and then I got better. But for at least 10 years, I had this horrible, uncontrollable fear of dogs whenever a dog would bite. You can understand that. And if something like that happens to you, it japs your brain. And sometimes I couldn't even walk out to get in my car if I heard a dog barking, and I had to ask somebody. It was silly. I mean, it was stupid. It was irrational, and I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't control it. And so somebody would walk with me to the car to make sure that I got. And sometimes if I was walking down the sidewalk and I heard a dog bark, I would just shift over. You know what I mean? It was one of these sort of subconscious biological things that happen when that happens to you. So it took a while for that to clear up, and now it's pretty much gone. And I think the fear of hell is similar. I think you teach that to kids, and they think about it, and they learn it, and they think, oh no, it's horrible. Well, you don't just get rid of that overnight. So it took me a while, even though I rationally knew that hell was just a myth, even though I concluded and knew that it was just a story that was made up. And there's no agreement among theologians about what this hell is anyway. Bart Ehrman just wrote a book a couple of years ago, totally reinterpreting what hell even means in the New Testament, that it's not eternal. But still, you're right. Psychologically, it can be very difficult to rebuild the brain after something like that happens to it. But you can do that. It just takes time.
What would you have considered to be the last straw that really pushed you out of Christianity?
So it was gradual, as I say. It would be like, as I said earlier, it'd be like asking you, when was the moment when you grew up? When was that moment? You probably couldn't point to a moment. You could probably point to maybe a general period in your life, and then when you look back on it, you go, "Oh, I'm through that now," without realizing there was some like actual point. I was saying this in a church, in a Unitarian church in Michigan some years ago, and I said that, when was the moment when you grew up? And this woman in the second row, she raised her hand and she says, I remember the exact moment, but I forget his name. And the whole place started laughing. But I do remember a moment, and maybe this fits with what you're asking, because I had pretty much, I think you move across the spectrum and you're further along than you realize. I didn't realize, I guess I'm further along. And I was down in a church in Mexico, just below the border, below Mexicali. They have these they're called ejidos, little villages around there. And there was an adobe church there. And I was sleeping in the Sunday school room on like this cot, because we just slept there right in the church. And the windows didn't have any glass. It was just open. And I was looking up at the stars. This was like 1983. And I guess I was an atheist at the time, but didn't know it. I didn't admit it to myself. It had already happened, but I hadn't really articulated it. You know what I mean? And I was thinking it through, and I'm wondering, well, what is God, and what is faith, and what is religion? And all my life, I had thought there were these angels and Holy Spirit and principalities and powers, and this big eyeball of God judging my inner thoughts, and you know what I mean? This master Lord who is always looking and knows your inner heart. So I was looking out that window up at the stars and looking at them and saying, wow, nature is amazing. Look at those amazing stars out there. And it was, for the first time in my life, I realized that I was alone in that room. It was just me in that open window and the stars. And just like those stars are ingesting matter, and then they burn for a while, and then they finally burn out and die off. I'm also like, I'm a natural thing too. I'm ingesting material we eat, and I'm glowing faintly. I have a temperature, and I'm going to burn for a while, but then I'm going to burn out and die. And it was almost like introducing myself to myself. I was almost like, oh, so that's who you are. I'm going to shake hands with myself. Oh, so you're a biological organism in a natural environment. And that's all there is. I was alone. I was just me. And that was kind of scary and exciting at the same time to realize that. It was a pretty neat moment. So I don't know if that qualifies for what you're asking, but it wasn't a last straw. It was like a last goodbye or something, where I realized, well, I guess what am I? Am I an atheist? I guess so. It was that kind of a thing.
I thought that fit my question pretty well, actually. Um, During your deconversion process, did you also find it strange that there were so many denominations of Christianity, and some even go as far as claiming that if even if you believe in Jesus and God, that if you don't have the correct interpretation of the Bible, you're going to go to hell anyway?
Yeah, but we always knew that. I always knew, as in my younger years, in my 20s and early 30s, when I was ultra confident preacher, I knew there were people with false teachings, and even the Bible talks about it. What I called false teachings. Of course, every group calls the other groups false teachings, and so a simplistic response to that is to say, well, it's sin and it's the devil, and they're being misled away from the truth that I have, that I know it. It's pretty amazing that everybody has the truth as they know it, but it's like uh, it's so self-referential. My theology, my interpretation has to be the right one. And I have to say that when I started abandoning all of that, it was almost painful, in the sense of I had to move myself down a few notches. I had to stop being so certain, so arrogant, I had to say, hey, wait a minute. You know, after millennia of theological disagreements and all these splits, I'm the guy who's got it all right. Finally, I'm the guy. I'm the one brain mind believer who's got it all figured out right, above against all these others. So I had to lower myself from that level and realize that there's a lot we don't know. And you're right. Even though Paul in the New Testament told Christians, let there be no divisions among you. You should all think with one mind, right? Yet he failed to tell the believers which was the right mind, and everyone thinks they have it. So you're right, Jacob. I think that tells us a lot about um, well, what does it tell us about the nature of belief? I suppose that we lock into our tribe, our group, as the truth. Of course, many of them, to their credit, think they can actually logically and reasonably explain to you why they have the right version and why another's else. But the Muslims can do the same thing, and the Orthodox Jews can do the same thing. So everybody has their apologists who can do that for their group. So that tells you something about this proclivity that we all have across the planet to believe in something so fiercely and to lock onto it as if it were absolute truth.
What do you think about the historical Jesus studies? Um, from what I remember reading the book, you expressed doubt that there was a historical Jesus.
Yeah, well, everybody would say, well, I mean, every historian would say there's doubt. It might be a 2% doubt, it might be a 98% doubt. Um, every historical claim ever made has some level of probability to it that's not 100%. Even something like Abraham Lincoln or whatever, there's always going to be some probability level that you're at. But when it gets high enough, when it gets to 95, 98, 99%, we round it off and say, yes, of course, Abraham Lincoln lived. Look at all the wealth of evidence in that. So in answering the question about Jesus, we have to be careful to distinguish between the Jesus of the New Testament, that character that you read in the Bible, and the Jesus of history. They may not have been the same person, or they may have been the same person, but one is an exaggeration. And one analogy I could give is the story of Paul Bunyan. If you know the story of Paul Bunyan, this big Northwoods woodsman with an axe, and he had a big blue ox, and he dug the Great Lakes as a watering hole for his ox and did all these amazing things. I don't think anyone believes that Paul Bunyan, that cartoon character Paul Bunyan, actually existed. However, it is possible that there was a Paul Bunyan upon whom that legend was based. There might have been a historical Paul Bunyan. The stories were written about 40 years later. The first stories about Paul Bunyan, referring back to the time when the French were fighting the British, and there could have been this Paul Bunyan, big guy who did some amazing things in battle, and the stories then were later written about it. So we have to distinguish between the Paul Bunyan of the stories, later stories, and the Paul Bunyan who might have lived in history. It's not impossible. We can do the same with Jesus. There's this Jesus of the stories who did all these amazing things. And as you look at the stories and put them in the chronology when they were written, the legend grows in history from Paul, especially with the resurrection stories, from Paul to Mark to Matthew to Luke to John, where you get this huge growth of imagine. In fact, John even wrote there, he did so many things you couldn't even put him in a book, right? So if we look at the Jesus of the New Testament, that character did not exist. That Paul Bunyan character didn't exist. However, if we look at the Jesus of history, there might have been a first century Yeshua the Christ. There were others. There was a Judas the Christ. There was a Theudas the Christ. There were other self-proclaimed messiahs back then. And it's not impossible that there was a Yeshua the Christ. And in fact, some of the early parts of the New Testament stories are not that improbable. In fact, the crucifixion of this character is pretty coherent. That story, everything before the resurrection, could have happened. Anything before the resurrection, especially the crucifixion story. So to oversimplify this, I'm sure it's an oversimplification, I would say the probability that the historical Jesus existed is not zero. I might put it at 20 or 30 or 40%, somewhere in that range, because it's possible. It's not impossible. But I would say the likelihood of the probability of the New Testament Jesus existing is not 100%. It's obviously it's very, 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 very low. It's probably 1% or 0.5% of that this miracle working character could have existed. So it depends on what Jesus you're asking about. Yes, the Jesus of history may have existed. I don't know if we can prove it or not. I think, but a lot of historians do is they round it off. So if you think your probability is 50%, less than 50%, and you're forced to round it off, if you were forced to, you would have to say, well, then no. But you're not forced to round it off. Likewise, somebody like Bart Ehrman might say his confidence is more like 70%. Who knows where he would put that number? In which case, he would round it off and say, well, yes, it's very likely that Jesus did exist. So keep that in mind. And there's more to say about why the story is suspicious and contradictory. But that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of how I think about it.
In page 3, state that some fell prostrate to the floor in submission to the Creator. People stood to speak in tongues, and others translated the heavenly languages into English. Some practiced faith healing, prophecy, discernment, diagnosis of problems, such as evil spirits and other gifts of the Spirit, that accompany being baptized in the Holy Spirit. It was a night that changed my life. How did it change your life? What did it feel like to you?
Well, so that happened in my teens, and I'm not a great psychologist, but I'm guessing that for a lot of young people, they're thinking about their future, what they want to do with their life, what direction you might want to go, and especially if you believe that the world's going to end soon, which is what I was taught and what I did believe. Moments like that what you might call spiritual moments, can be very affirming. And I eventually felt what I was convinced was a call to the ministry. And so I devoted my entire life toward preaching the gospel. So it changed everything completely because I believed it was true. And I sometimes saw what I was convinced were answers to prayer, like miracles. I saw them. And I explained a few of them in the book. Of course, there's this confirmation bias that happens. When you see something that looks like it confirms your faith, you count that as a hit, right? You put that in the plus column. But the other 99 times when prayer failed or nothing happened, you ignore those. You don't put them in the debit column. It's just this bias that, well, once in a while, it would be a true miracle if prayers were never answered, because just by random chance and by coincidence, some people are going to organically get better and who were prayed for. But at the time, I was convinced that I was seeing answers to prayer, and I was feeling the Holy Spirit, and I was getting goosebumps, and I was feeling like this presence in my mind, and it changed my life. And that I decided to become a full-time minister, to preach, to travel, to evangelize, to missionize, and to write Christian music. I wrote a lot of Christian songs. By the way, I'm still getting royalties from some of that music, even today, a little bit, not a lot, but. So I think others who go into the ministry will give you a similar story about their calling or about the impetus or the drive to go. In fact, if you know about the Clergy Project, there's now about 1,200 members of the Clergy Project, former ministers like me, or priests, or some imams or rabbis, who used to believe, and now they don't. They're agnostics or they're non-supernaturalists. Many of them will tell the same story I just told. There was something in their younger years that was very motivating to them to cause them to want to go out and preach.
In page 271, you say that before returning to heaven, Mithras celebrated a Last Supper with his 12 disciples, who represents the 12 signs of the zodiac. In memory of this, his worshippers partook of a sacramental meal of bread, marked with a cross. This was one of the 7 Mithraic sacraments, the models for the Christian 7 sacraments. It was called Midst, Latin Missa, English Mass. Mithras' image was buried in a rock tomb. He was withdrawn from it and said to live again. Like early Christianity, Mithraism was an ascetic, anti-female religion. Its priesthood consisted of celibate men only. Are there additional parallels that you see between Mithraism and Christianity?
Well, right there, that's enough. But we have to be careful. Mithras is not Mithra. Mithra was a Persian god, and Mithras was a newer, made-up religion that Roman soldiers brought back from Persia. And we don't really know how it got started, but it became like a cult, the cult of Mithras, where there was a bull and there were constellations and zodiac and the 12 signs, and they would meet in caves. And in fact, you can still see some of the caves. So Mithraism is the more modern Roman, you could say, version or corruption of an ancient. They misunderstood. The Roman soldiers who brought it back, they didn't really know much about the Persian religion, but they brought this cult with them. And so when we're talking about Mithraism, we're talking about this weird kind of offshoot cult that happened in the Roman world that was practiced. It started with soldiers, but it grew from there. And so they did have a lot of those practices that paralleled. It wasn't that they necessarily paralleled Christianity, as if Christianity were the standard that things were paralleling. It's the idea here is that Christianity and Mithraism and other groups, to some degree or other, to some level or other, were feeding off this, a basic template, a basic general understanding of what religions were at the time. And of course, the number 12 is big in a lot of those religions because of the 12 hours of the 12 signs of the zodiac. And it might be a little bit of a stretch to say that his image was carved out of a rock and compare that to the resurrection, as if they were copying it or something. But it did happen. And so we do see parallels. We have to be careful because correlation does not imply causation. So sometimes we see a lot of that. A modern day example would be the musical West Side Story. When Leonard Bernstein and Stephen Sondheim were writing West Side Story, they admitted from the outset that their template for that musical was Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. That story of, instead of Romeo and Juliet, you had Maria and Tony, was that his name? And instead of the Montagues and the Capulets, you had the Sharks and the Jets. And so the whole thing was moved. The whole story was basically imported from one era into a more modern, and they modernized it, they changed it, they adapted it, they made the ending different. But if you kind of step back and look at it and squint, you can see they're kind of the same story. A lot of the details are different, obviously. So Bernstein and Sondheim were trying to improve and make it more relative to their day. So we see that with a lot of ancient religions as well. Some of them are taking these templates, these stories, and they're rewriting them, they're changing them, they're making them not exactly 100% parallels, but they're making them fit a general template. So we can see that with Mithraism and Dionysus. We can see that. I was just reading the story of Spartacus, the Roman slave who escaped and beat the Roman army. It's a pretty neat story. At least 3 major battles. These slaves defeated the Roman army. But in order to do that, Spartacus motivated his troops by instilling the rituals and the religion of his worship of Dionysus, or however you say it, Dionysius, and it worked. The slave soldiers were motivated by that to go out and fight. So the religious stories like this can be very motivating in starting a religious movement. So I think there's some value. I don't know if I would put too much value on those parallels, but it obviously shows us that to a great degree, a lot of those religions were kind of cut from the same general fabric and then maybe reworked a bit.
How did your examination of the contradictions in the New Testament change when you went from being a Christian to becoming an atheist?
Well, I didn't see the contradictions. I had an ideology, a dogma that the Bible was inerrant, that it was perfect. So if you have that view, then there's no contradictions. You won't even see that it's a contradiction because in the back of your mind, it's all part of a bigger plan that's all harmonious and together. So the first step is to just get yourself to see it. And even if you think you can explain it, at least look at the contradictions. So, and there's a bunch of them, but probably the biggest example of the contradictory New Testament is the resurrection story. It's given at least 5 times, four gospels, and then 1 Corinthians 15 has a version of it. And when you compare those stories, they cannot all have been right. There are versions of the Bible you can buy that after the gospels, the 4 gospels, it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when it really should have been Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. There's a section called a harmony of the gospels. And you can go through this harmony of the gospels and look at this verse and compare with that. But my question is, why would the gospels need to be harmonized? Why are they admitting that there's some problem that calls for harmonization? These harmonies of the gospel are obviously admitting that there's something, on the surface at least, there's something wrong. They don't match. When the women arrived at the tomb on Easter morning, was the tomb open or was it closed? You'll find both versions of it. And so there's Christian apologists who try to say, well, there were 2 visits. They try to find some way to work around the obvious face level contradictions that we find in the Bible. And once you question or abandon your faith, then suddenly a lot of these contradictions become just clear. You go like, how did I miss that? Why did I preach from this, but why did I not see that? So it doesn't disprove the Bible and it doesn't disprove God, but it does show that at least one or maybe more of those writers was wrong. Maybe one or more of them was right, but at least they can't all have been right.
Did the immorality of the God character contribute to your deconversion?
Not really. My main question was, is it true? And later the question, is it moral, came up. And of course, now I'm convinced that that's probably even a better reason. When I sent out my letter of deconversion to all my friends and relatives and co-missionaries, co-pastors, Christian publishers, I sent out about 50 letters. This long before email. Um, I I invited people to dialogue, and my mother got the letter. They lived in Arizona at the time, and they were shocked. Their ordained minister's son. I got this letter saying, "I don't believe anymore." It's just a one-page letter, and it's in the book. It's reprinted in the book. So she got on a bus and came all the way over to Ontario, California, and she later told me, because I forgot what we talked about. We talked late into the night. Mom wanted to know, what happened to you? What happened to Danny? He's now an atheist. And she told me that we had talked about the Bible, and that I had said to her, Mom, look at these stories in the Old Testament. You're a Sunday school teacher. You're teaching these stories to children. Do you really want to teach this story to children? Look at what God did here, how the complete genocide of entire villages, and the story of how David became king, because King Saul before him had disobeyed God by keeping a couple animals alive. God told him to destroy all the Amalekites, destroy them all, men, women, children, animals, and everything. And Saul kept a few animals. And what Saul said to God through Samuel, he was talking through Samuel, what Saul said was, well, I was keeping those animals alive to make a sacrifice to God. I was doing it because I wanted to thank God, so I didn't kill them all. And that little mistake caused God to get so angry. He got so mad. He said, you did not obey. Obedience is better than sacrifice, he said. I don't care if you sacrifice to me. I want you to obey me. And since Saul did not obey, he was dethroned. He lost his kingship. And then God found a man after God's own heart, David, young David. And the reason David was a man after God's own heart was because he would mercilessly follow every order to the letter. And the women were celebrating the installation of King David by saying, Saul killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. So if you want to be a man after God's own heart, you have to be a 100% ruthless, bloodthirsty, genocidal monster. And of course, the Bible, I wrote a whole book about it, God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction, showing that it's a good thing that God doesn't exist. If that God existed, he's jealous, he's angry, he's pyromaniacal, he's a flamethrower, he's bloodthirsty, he needs things to die. He actually takes credit for raping women in the book of Jeremiah, and dismisses women, and is misogynistic, and of course says that gays should be killed or blood shall be upon them, and on and on and on. And there's like 30 different categories of things that you can say that the God of the Bible is beneath our respect as a moral person. If he does exist, then we might have to bow before his power, but we cannot bow before his morality. We cannot respect that being as a moral being.
What do you think of the arguments for the intelligent design of the universe that that apologists often use, like things like the Kalam cosmological argument or other similar arguments?
So I think in that book there's a chapter about the Kalam cosmological argument. In one of my books, I have that chapter. I call it um, cosmological calamity with a K, calamity, where I think I show that the Kalam cosmological argument is based on bad premises, and it's actually comparing apples and oranges, and that I'm sure you know what it is. Everything that begins to exist had a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. So that doesn't prove a God. That just, if that argument is true, and there's good reason to suspect it's it's not. Those premises are bad. But if it's true, all it gets us to is a cause. It doesn't get us to a God at all. And what a lot of apologists will say is, well, that is consistent with a God. One thing that's really, really suspicious about the Kalam is that first phrase, everything that begins to exist. If you just swallow that phrase, you are basically assuming that reality can be divided into two groups, things that begin to exist and things that don't. Otherwise, you wouldn't use that phrase, everything that begins to exist. You are already, to some degree, begging the question. You're already smuggling into your initial premise the idea that there is something that doesn't begin to exist, which is what you're trying to prove in the first place, that there's this eternal being. The Kalam is also based on this idea of the impossibility of an infinite regress. If the universe is eternal, that means there is an unending series of preceding events, an infinite series of preceding events before this current moment. But since you cannot traverse eternity, you can't get to the end of eternity, then you could never have gotten to now. That's what they say in the Kalam argument. Therefore, the preceding events could not have been eternal. There must have been a first event by what they would think is mathematical reasoning. But you could turn that around. You could take that same argument and say, well, okay, if there's a God, this God has a mind that is functioning. This God has a brain that's having one thought followed by another, right? And it's in some kind of a sensible sequence. This God makes a decision and then does the action. Suppose one day God created the universe and then said, oh, I created a universe. Now I better decide to create the universe. The deciding happens antecedent, whether in time or out of time. So in the mind of this creator God, this causal God, there are preceding events before he decided that. He's thinking this and thinking that. And if it's true that you can never traverse an infinite series of events to get to now, God couldn't have done that either, which means that God himself must have had a first cause. I know some apologists try to distinguish between like a numerical infinity and then other types of infinity to get around that. Or some of them try to say God exists outside of time, as if that is even a coherent thought. But anyway, there's a lot of ways to address the Kalam in these cosmological arguments. And with a lot of these arguments, not all of them, what you can do is take the argument itself and apply it to God himself, assuming that this God exists. Take that same argument. If like, let's go to the design arguments, like teleological. If the appearance of design and functional complexity requires a designer, like Paley's watch, right, on the ground. Here's this watch. It looks like it's working, and it means it was designed, not necessarily by one person, maybe by a number of people, or maybe by trial and error over many centuries. But in any event, if it's true that functional complexity requires a designer, take that argument, look at the mind of God. Isn't God's mind functioning? Isn't it complex? It's not just a jumble of randomness? If there's a God, his brain is also an amazing clockwork of whatever is happening. If it's true that functional complexity requires a designer, then so does the functional complexity of the mind of the designer. The designer has to be at least as complex as the thing that it made. You can read that in Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. So you don't get anywhere by saying, well, this watch was designed by a designer. Well, who designed the designer? A 5-year-old can ask that. If God made everything, who made God? I know there are apologists and theologians who have some workarounds for that problem, but it's a serious problem.
How would you compare the Satan character with God? Do you think they're very different, or are they just two nasty characters in the same myth?
So Satan is hard to pin down. If you're talking about the Bible, Satan in the Bible, the devil or Satan. And by the way, in Genesis 3, that animal there, that Nahash character, which a lot of scholars translate as a snake or a serpent, which makes sense. It didn't have any legs. It's not called Satan in Genesis. It's later Christians who interpreted back to that and say, well, that must have been Satan in the but the actual story doesn't call it Satan. It's just this animal. But to compare God and Satan, you have what criteria, what metrics are you using? If you use the metric of killing, let's say, the God of the Old Testament was responsible for millions of deaths, directly either committed, commanded, or condoned by himself. Just take the flood for one example. If the flood happened, and it did not, but if it did happen, maybe we're wrong, the population of the earth at that time would have been around 20 million human beings. So there's 20 million people right there. And then you look at sometimes you don't know exact numbers, but you look at the genocides of all these cities and these villages in the conquest of Canaan and so on. So we're talking about millions of deaths directly caused by this angry God, because he's angry because they didn't love him. They didn't obey him. That's why. How many deaths do you think Satan caused in the Bible? Do you happen to know that?
If I remember correctly, I think it was something like 10, and this is mostly, if not entirely, involving the book of Job.
You're exactly right. It was 10, and it's only 10. And those 10 that Satan killed, he caused a large wind to blow over this wall. Conveniently, all 10 of Job's grown children were standing by the same wall, and it fell over and killed them. Satan could only do that with God's permission. Satan had to first go ask God. And so who's responsible? The hitman or the person who hired the hitman? Basically, when Satan went to God, he said, "You're bragging about Job, how perfect he is." And God said, "Yeah, Job is perfect. He had done nothing wrong." And so Satan went out and killed his kids and killed the animals also, if you count animals in there, and caused all the stuff. But still, Job did not curse God with his lips, or whatever the phrase is. He did not sin with God. He didn't curse God. And so Satan went back a second time, and God was rejoicing, saying, "See, look, Job stayed with me, even though you did all that stuff." And Satan was saying, "Well, that's only because you kept him alive, or you didn't attack him personally." And so Satan asked for permission again. Can I go after Job even further? And in Job, what is it? I forget the exact verse. I think it's chapter 2, verse 3, where God said, "You have caused me to destroy Job for no reason." Right there in the Bible, it says for no reason. And there was no reason. Job was a good man. The only reason was that Satan wanted to prove something. So God even admits that he gave Satan permission to torment Job for no reason. Well, what if somebody went to a court of law and said, "Well, yeah, I destroyed that family. I had no reason. The devil made me do it." We wouldn't take that as an excuse. We would denounce the morality of a person who would act like that. And that's how God acted in the Bible.
Final question. How do you look at everything the way it is today with religion and people coming out? Do you have confidence that eventually um, religion will eventually uh, continue to shrink and shrink and shrink over a long period of time?
Yeah, I do have confidence, but that doesn't mean I'm right. But if we look at Europe, for example, and put aside the United States for a minute, Europe went through horrible holy wars and Catholics killing Protestants. The 30 Years' War had a lot of reasons, but some of the main reasons were the confessional differences between Catholics and Protestants over silly things like infant baptism and transubstantiation and whatever, fighting with each other, killing, bloodshed, horrible, people lining up. But today, most Europeans are past all of that, maybe partly because of that, and maybe also partly because of World War II. But today, in most European countries, religion has not disappeared, but in most European countries, the people are pretty secular, especially in Nordic countries. Phil Zuckerman did a study of Denmark and found that about 4% of the Danes believe in a God. 4%. Although roughly 50% of the Danes would call themselves cultural Christians. They'll get married in the church, they'll get buried in the church, and so on, but they don't believe it. It's kind of like most American Jews. They love their heritage, but they don't believe the stories. They don't believe in God. So that happened in Europe, and you've got these gorgeous cathedrals over in Europe that are pretty much empty, except they've got tourists coming through them. We were just there a couple of weeks ago in Spain and in Germany, and the people in those, most of the people, I mean, they do use them for mass, of course, for some people, but most of the people there were tourists. And so it seems like what happened in Europe is starting to happen in the United States. We're starting to catch up, basically. And if you look at Denmark, for example, it's a very happy country. It has its problems, of course, but as far as any level of well-being, you know, the healthcare and women's rights and freedoms, it's a very functional country with no religion at all. In fact, the countries and the states that have less religion tend to be better off when it comes to most measures of individual and social well-being. Of course, there's exceptions. So it looks like what's happening in the United States is paralleling what happened in Europe. And maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now, we will be pretty much in the same position where, especially among young people today, who are really fed up with religion, and especially religion getting mixed with politics. So, but it doesn't have to be that way. There could be some, I don't know, some big global catastrophe or something that scares people and moves them all back to religion again. I don't know. I lost the gift of prophecy a long time ago. But looking at current trends, if current trends continue, and that's a big if, but if current trends continue, it looks like we can be optimistic that the United States is becoming less and less religious, which is a good thing.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dan Barker.
Well, it was fun, Jacob. You got a name right out of the Bible.
I sure do.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely enjoyed this conversation, and I would like to have you back at some point.
Good. We can talk about morality or free will, maybe, or my next book is called The End of Worship. Maybe that one.
Yeah, we need to talk about that for sure. Well, thanks again, Dan.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.